How many times have you been told that you're intimidating? Too intense, too serious, too difficult to read, too much, too different, too quiet, too confident, too independent. Listen carefully, because it's time to clear something up. You are not intimidating, at least not in the way they've convinced themselves you are. The truth is far more revealing. What many people call intimidating is often their reaction to authenticity. It's what happens when someone who has spent years adjusting themselves to fit expectations encounters a person who no longer feels the need to perform. It's what happens when someone who survives through masks suddenly stands in front of someone who has stopped wearing them. And that's where the discomfort begins. Because authenticity has a strange effect on people. It doesn't force anyone to change. It doesn't attack anyone. It doesn't even make demands. It simply exists. Yet that alone can create enormous tension in environments built on pretending. Think about your own experiences. How many times have people formed opinions about you before truly knowing you? How many times have others assumed you were judging them when you were simply observing? How many times have your boundaries been interpreted as arrogance, your self-respect mistaken for pride, or your silence mistaken for hostility? That's not because you're doing something wrong. It's because your presence disrupts expectations. Many chosen ones spend years trying to understand why certain people seem uncomfortable around them despite having done nothing to deserve it. They replay conversations. They analyze interactions. They wonder if they should become more agreeable, more predictable, more accommodating. But here's what they eventually discover. The discomfort was never coming from their behavior. It was coming from the reflection they unintentionally created. Because when a person is standing firmly in their truth, everyone around them is quietly invited to examine their own. And not everyone wants that invitation. Over the next few minutes, we're going to uncover why your authenticity feels so threatening to certain people, why toxic individuals often label truth-tellers as intimidating, and why the very quality others criticize may actually be one of the clearest signs that you're walking exactly where you're meant to be. Number 1. The unspoken authority. One of the most confusing experiences for many chosen ones is walking into a room and immediately sensing a reaction they never asked for. Nobody has spoken yet. No disagreement has occurred. No conflict exists. And yet certain people seem uneasy, guarded, or strangely defensive. For years, you may have wondered what was causing it. The answer is simpler than most people realize. It isn't intimidation. It's contrast. You see, most people associate authority with volume. They think authority comes from being the loudest person in the room, having the most impressive title, commanding attention through force, or constantly reminding others of their importance. But genuine authority works differently. Genuine authority rarely announces itself. It doesn't need to. When a person knows who they are, there is a calmness about them that cannot be manufactured. There is no desperation for approval, no urgency to impress, no constant need to explain their worth. They enter a space carrying an energy that says, "I know who I am, whether you recognize it or not." And that changes everything. Listen carefully. The people who react most strongly to your presence are often reacting to what your presence reveals about them. Someone who is secure doesn't feel threatened by authenticity. Someone who is comfortable with themselves doesn't become unsettled by another person's confidence. But when a person has spent years building an identity around appearances, validation, or external approval, encountering someone who no longer depends on those things can feel deeply uncomfortable. That's why chosen ones are often described as intimidating without doing anything intimidating at all. You're not threatening people. You're disrupting illusions. Think about how many social environments operate. Many groups unconsciously organize themselves around performance. People learn what to say, how to act, which opinions are acceptable, and which parts of themselves need to remain hidden. Over time, that performance becomes normal. Eventually, people forget they're even doing it. Then someone like you enters the room. You aren't trying to dominate anyone. You aren't trying to compete. You aren't trying to prove a point. You're simply being yourself. But that authenticity changes the atmosphere because it reminds others that another way of existing is possible. And that reminder can be unsettling. The reason is simple. Authenticity creates contrast. The more comfortable you become with who you are, the more visible other people's insecurities become. Not because you're exposing them, but because they're exposing themselves in response to your presence. You've probably noticed this before. Some people begin oversharing the moment they meet you. Others become unusually defensive. Some start trying to impress you. Others begin explaining themselves even when no explanation was requested. It's almost as if your presence activates something inside them. That's because it does. Your grounded nature forces people into an unconscious comparison with themselves. Again, not because you're judging them. Most of the time, you're simply existing. But when someone encounters an individual who appears comfortable without constant validation, it challenges assumptions they may have built their entire identity around. Now here's where it gets interesting. The chosen one doesn't usually recognize this power because it feels natural. You don't wake up thinking about commanding a room. You don't spend your day trying to create influence. You're simply operating from a place that many people have never fully reached: alignment. And alignment carries weight. People can sense when someone is pretending. They can sense when confidence is forced. They can sense when charisma is rehearsed. But they can also sense when someone is genuinely at peace with themselves. That kind of presence doesn't need words to be felt. That's why some of the most powerful people you'll ever meet are often the quietest. They don't need to convince anyone. They don't need to announce their value. They don't need to chase attention. Their energy speaks before they do. Unfortunately, insecure people often misinterpret that energy. Instead of seeing confidence, they see a threat. Instead of seeing authenticity, they see competition. Instead of seeing self-respect, they see arrogance. Not because that's what's actually there, but because that's the filter they're viewing it through. And that's the lesson many chosen ones eventually learn. You are not responsible for how others interpret your light. You are not responsible for shrinking yourself to protect someone else's comfort. You are not responsible for becoming smaller so that people who are avoiding their own growth can feel larger. The truth is that your presence carries a kind of unspoken authority. Not because you're trying to lead, but because you've stopped abandoning yourself. And in a world where so many people are disconnected from who they truly are, that alone can feel powerful enough to recalibrate an entire room. Number 2, the mirror effect. One of the most misunderstood aspects of being a chosen one is that people often assume you're creating reactions that you never intended to create. They think you're judging them when you're not. They think you're trying to expose them when you're simply existing. They think you're making some kind of statement when, in reality, you're just being yourself. What they don't understand is that the discomfort they're experiencing isn't coming from you. It's coming from what they see when they look at themselves in your presence. This is what I call the mirror effect. And once you understand it, years of confusing interactions suddenly begin to make sense. Think about it. A healthy person rarely feels threatened by another person's authenticity. Someone who is secure doesn't become angry because another person is confident. Someone who has done their inner work doesn't become defensive because another person is comfortable setting boundaries. In fact, emotionally mature people are usually inspired by those qualities. But people carrying unresolved wounds often react differently. Your peace highlights their chaos. Your honesty highlights their performance. Your self-respect highlights their self-abandonment. Your discipline highlights their excuses. And none of that requires you to say a single word. That's why some people become strangely uncomfortable around chosen ones. They're not responding to what you're doing. They're responding to what your existence forces them to confront. Listen, most people spend years avoiding certain truths about themselves. They bury disappointments. They suppress regrets. They ignore unhealthy patterns. They create distractions to avoid dealing with unresolved pain. Over time, those avoidance strategies become part of their identity. Then suddenly they encounter someone who has chosen a different path. Someone who stopped pretending. Someone who stopped seeking approval. someone who became comfortable standing alone if necessary. And without meaning to, that person becomes a living reminder of everything they've been avoiding. That's why manipulators often react so strongly to grounded individuals. A manipulator survives by controlling perception. They need confusion. They need uncertainty. They need people questioning themselves more than they question the situation. But when they encounter someone who trusts their intuition, values truth over approval, and remains emotionally centered under pressure, many of their usual tactics stop working. And that's deeply frustrating for them, because for perhaps the first time in a long time, they're standing in front of someone they cannot easily influence. You may have noticed this pattern throughout your life. Certain people seem determined to get a reaction out of you. Certain people kept testing your boundaries. Certain people appeared unusually invested in changing your opinion, gaining your approval, or proving something to you. At the time, those interactions may have seemed random. They weren't. The mirror was active. Your presence was quietly exposing insecurities that had nothing to do with you. What's fascinating is that many of these individuals don't consciously understand what's happening. They genuinely believe you're the problem. They convince themselves that you're too intense, too distant, too difficult, too intimidating, or somehow responsible for the discomfort they're feeling. But here's the truth. A mirror doesn't create what's reflected. It reveals it. If someone constantly feels judged by people who are simply being authentic, there's a good chance they're carrying judgment toward themselves. If someone becomes angry whenever another person sets healthy boundaries, there's a good chance they're benefiting from weak boundaries elsewhere. If someone feels threatened by confidence, there's a good chance they're struggling with their own sense of worth. Again, none of this is about superiority. The chosen one isn't better than anyone else. The chosen one simply chose growth over avoidance. And that choice creates contrast. Now, this doesn't mean your journey has been easy. In fact, many chosen ones become mirrors precisely because they've spent years confronting their own darkness. They've faced rejection. They've worked through heartbreak. They've survived betrayal. They've been forced to examine parts of themselves they would rather have ignored. That's why their energy feels different. It's earned. There's a depth that comes from surviving difficult seasons without allowing those seasons to define you. There's a wisdom that comes from learning painful lessons instead of running from them. There's a stability that develops when you've spent enough time rebuilding yourself from the inside out. People can feel that, even if they can't explain it. And when someone who is still avoiding their own healing encounters that level of authenticity, the reaction can be intense. Some become inspired. Some become defensive. Some become curious. Some become hostile. But almost nobody remains unaffected. That's because truth has a frequency of its own. Not the loud, performative kind of truth that seeks attention. The quiet kind. The grounded kind. The kind that exists without needing validation. And that's what many people are actually responding to when they call you intimidating. They're not afraid of you. They're afraid of what becomes visible when you're around. They're afraid of the conversations they haven't had with themselves. They're afraid of the wounds they haven't healed. They're afraid of the masks they've become dependent on. Most importantly, they're afraid of the possibility that deep down, they already know the truth. And your presence makes it harder to keep pretending they don't. Number 3, unfamiliarity with authenticity. One of the hardest truths for many chosen ones to accept is that a large percentage of the world is operating from performance rather than authenticity. Not because people are evil, not because everyone is intentionally deceptive, but because many individuals learned very early in life that acceptance was conditional. They learned that certain emotions were acceptable while others were not. They learned that speaking honestly could lead to rejection. They learned that fitting in was often rewarded, while standing out came with consequences. Over time, they adapted. They became experts at reading the room, adjusting their personalities, and presenting whatever version of themselves seemed most likely to receive approval. Eventually, the performance became automatic. And that's where the problem begins. Because when performance becomes normal, authenticity starts looking strange. Think about that for a moment. In a system where most people are constantly editing themselves, filtering themselves, and adjusting themselves to meet expectations, a person who speaks honestly can appear disruptive. A person who says what they mean can appear rebellious. A person who refuses to play social games can appear intimidating. Not because they're doing anything wrong, but because they're operating according to a completely different set of rules. That's why chosen ones often feel misunderstood in environments built on appearances. You aren't refusing to participate because you're arrogant. You aren't detached because you're cold. You aren't difficult because you're trying to create problems. You're simply unwilling to abandon yourself in order to make everyone else comfortable. And for people who have spent years doing exactly that, your behavior can feel deeply unfamiliar. Listen, most toxic systems survive through predictable roles. Every person has a function. Someone plays the peacemaker. Someone plays the rescuer. Someone plays the victim. Someone plays the controller. Someone plays the entertainer. Over time, these roles become so established that nobody questions them anymore. Then a chosen one enters the picture. Or perhaps a chosen one finally wakes up and stops participating. Suddenly the old role no longer fits. The person who was expected to stay quiet starts speaking honestly. The person who was expected to tolerate disrespect starts setting boundaries. The person who was expected to seek approval stops asking for permission. And just like that, the system begins malfunctioning. Not because you're attacking it, because you're no longer feeding it. This is why some people react so strongly when you change. They often claim you've become different, when in reality, you've become more authentic. They accuse you of acting strange, when the truth is you've simply stopped acting. The version of you they were comfortable with was often the version that sacrificed parts of itself to maintain peace. But real growth makes that impossible. Once you've experienced authenticity, it's incredibly difficult to return to performance. Once you've learned the value of boundaries, it's difficult to return to self-abandonment. Once you've tasted inner peace, it's difficult to keep participating in chaos just to maintain approval. That's why your presence creates such confusion in certain environments. You become a reminder that people have choices. A reminder that they don't have to keep pretending. A reminder that they don't have to remain trapped inside identities they've outgrown. And while some people find that inspiring, others find it threatening. Because authenticity creates responsibility. The moment someone sees another person living honestly, they can no longer pretend they don't have a choice. They may still choose the mask. They may still choose performance. They may still choose approval over truth. But now they're aware that another path exists. And awareness changes everything. This is why toxic environments often label authentic people as difficult. It's easier to blame the truth teller than to question the system. It's easier to criticize the person setting boundaries than to examine why those boundaries are necessary. It's easier to call someone intimidating than to admit they're simply comfortable being themselves. The chosen one short-circuits the system because they stop responding to the rewards and punishments that keep everyone else in line. Praise doesn't control them. Criticism doesn't define them. Social pressure doesn't move them the way it once did. Their decisions increasingly come from alignment rather than approval. And that's incredibly difficult for performative people to understand, because they're still operating under the assumption that acceptance is the highest goal. The chosen one has discovered something higher. Truth. Not perfect truth. Not performative truth. Not convenient truth. Authentic truth. The kind of truth that allows a person to sleep peacefully at night because they're no longer living a double life. The kind of truth that creates consistency between who you are in public and who you are in private. The kind of truth that doesn't require constant maintenance because it isn't built on a performance. And that's why they call you intimidating. Not because you're threatening. Not because you're superior. But because in a world full of masks, authenticity feels unfamiliar. And unfamiliar things have a way of exposing just how artificial the old system really was. Number 4, the divine codes. There is another reason certain people struggle to understand you, and it goes far beyond personality, confidence, or social dynamics. In fact, many of the reactions you've experienced throughout your life cannot be fully explained by those things alone. Some people sense something about you that they cannot identify. They can't put it into words. They can't explain it logically, but they feel it. Have you ever noticed how complete strangers sometimes react strongly to you before you've even spoken? Have you ever walked into a room and felt as though people were studying you, trying to figure you out, yet never quite succeeding? Have you ever had individuals make assumptions about your character, your intentions, or your capabilities despite knowing almost nothing about you? What they're sensing isn't necessarily your personality. It's your depth, and depth has become increasingly rare. Listen carefully. Most people live on the surface. Their decisions are guided by appearances, trends, social approval, and immediate gratification. There is nothing unusual about that. Modern life often encourages it. But chosen ones tend to operate differently. Through hardship, isolation, betrayal, and self-discovery, they develop layers that cannot be easily understood through casual observation. They learn to listen beyond words. They learn to trust intuition. They learn to recognize patterns. They learn to value substance over appearances. As a result, they begin carrying a kind of wisdom that doesn't come from books alone. It comes from experience. It comes from surviving situations that force them to grow beyond who they once were. That's why superficial people often struggle around them. Because depth cannot be imitated for long. Someone can copy your style. Someone can copy your language. Someone can copy your habits. But they cannot copy the lessons you earned. They cannot copy the resilience developed through heartbreak. They cannot copy the discernment developed through betrayal. They cannot copy the wisdom developed through years of rebuilding yourself after disappointment. Those things become part of your energetic signature. And whether people understand it or not, they feel it. This is where many chosen ones make a mistake. They spend years trying to make themselves easier to understand. They simplify their thoughts. They soften their insights. They dilute their presence. They try to become more digestible so that others will feel comfortable around them. But here's the problem. The things that make you powerful are often the very things that make you difficult to categorize. You weren't designed to fit neatly into boxes. You weren't designed to think exactly like everyone else. You weren't designed to abandon your depth in exchange for acceptance. That's why people often describe you using contradictory terms. One person sees wisdom while another sees mystery. One person sees confidence while another sees intimidation. One person sees authenticity while another sees rebellion. The reality is that they're all reacting to the same thing. A person who cannot be easily programmed. And that's what unsettles toxic individuals the most. Manipulation requires predictability. It requires emotional buttons that can be pushed on demand. It requires insecurities that can be exploited. It requires a person who is disconnected enough from themselves to be controlled by external pressure. But when someone has spent years developing self-awareness, those old methods become less effective. The chosen one becomes harder to read because they're no longer reacting from wounds. They're responding from wisdom. And there is a difference. A wounded person reacts automatically. A wise person observes first. A wounded person seeks validation. A wise person seeks alignment. A wounded person follows the crowd. A wise person follows conviction. That distinction changes everything. Now, this doesn't mean you're perfect. It doesn't mean you've figured everything out. It doesn't mean you never struggle with doubt, fear, or uncertainty. What it means is that you've learned to trust something deeper than those temporary emotions. You've learned to trust your inner knowing. And that's why people often feel as though they can't quite decode you. Because they aren't dealing with someone who is constantly changing identities to gain approval. They're dealing with someone who has spent years discovering who they actually are. That's a completely different frequency. The truth is that your greatest strength has never been how loudly you speak, how much attention you receive, or how many people agree with you. Your greatest strength is the integrity between your inner world and your outer world. It's the fact that who you are in private increasingly matches who you are in public. In a world built on performance, that kind of consistency feels rare. In a world built on masks, it feels powerful. And in a world filled with people trying to become someone else, it feels almost impossible to imitate. That's why they call you intimidating. But the truth is far simpler than that. They don't fear your personality. They don't fear your confidence. They don't even fear your success. They fear what happens when a person becomes so connected to their truth that external manipulation loses its power. And whether they admit it or not, they recognize that quality the moment they see it. Number 5, protecting the holy space. After everything you've been through, there is one lesson that becomes impossible to ignore. Not everyone deserves access to you. That may sound simple, but for many chosen ones, it takes years of disappointment, betrayal, manipulation, and emotional exhaustion before that truth fully sinks in. Because your nature has always been to see the good in people. You've given second chances. You've extended understanding. You've tried to be patient with those who were still healing from their own wounds. But eventually, wisdom teaches what kindness alone cannot. There is a difference between compassion and access. There is a difference between understanding someone and allowing them into your sacred space. And there is a difference between loving people and allowing them to continuously drain your energy. Listen carefully. The reason so many people called you intimidating was never because you were dangerous. It was because your boundaries forced them to confront limitations they weren't used to hearing. People who benefit from unlimited access often interpret healthy boundaries as rejection. People who are accustomed to controlling others often interpret self-respect as arrogance. People who rely on emotional manipulation often interpret discernment as hostility. But none of those interpretations change the truth. Your boundaries are not cruelty. Your standards are not arrogance. Your self-respect is not intimidation. In fact, one of the greatest signs of spiritual maturity is learning to protect what you've worked so hard to build. Protect your peace. Protect your energy. Protect your healing. Protect the version of yourself that emerged from every difficult season stronger than before. Because here's what many chosen ones eventually realize. The same people who once criticized your boundaries were often the very people those boundaries were needed for. Let that sink in. You don't owe anyone unlimited access simply because they demand it. You don't owe anyone an explanation for every decision you make. And you certainly don't owe anyone a smaller version of yourself just because your authenticity makes them uncomfortable. Your light was never meant to be reduced to accommodate someone else's insecurity. Your voice was never meant to be silenced to protect someone's illusion. Your purpose was never meant to be postponed so others could remain comfortable. That's why this message is ultimately not about intimidation at all. It's about truth. The truth that your authenticity exposes what performance tries to hide. The truth that your presence reveals what manipulation tries to control. And the truth that the people who fear your light were never reacting to your power as much as they were reacting to the reflection it created within themselves. So moving forward, stop asking whether you're too much. Stop wondering whether you're too intense. Stop questioning whether your authenticity is making people uncomfortable. The right people won't need you to become less. The right people won't ask you to wear a mask. The right people won't feel threatened by your growth, your honesty, or your peace. They'll recognize it. They'll respect it. And they'll celebrate it. If this message resonated with you, make sure to subscribe, share this video with someone who needs this reminder today, and leave the word authentic in the comments below if you've made the decision to stop shrinking yourself for people who were never committed to understanding you. Because at the end of the day, you are not intimidating. You are simply standing in your truth. And for those who have built their lives on masks, nothing is more powerful than a person who no longer needs one.